I wasn't always someone who believed in the supernatural. In fact, I never was. My life was quite simple. I worked night shifts at an abandoned factory, doing maintenance rounds, checking that the few machines left there weren't looted or destroyed. It wasn't the ideal job, but it paid the bills. And I liked the tranquility that came with the solitude. It was hours without distractions, just me and the echo of my own footsteps in those long, empty hallways. I remember it all began a few months ago, on one of those seemingly normal nights. It was a typical night shift, with silence only broken by the distant buzz of a few flickering fluorescent lights. I was used to this routine, so monotonous that sometimes I doubted whether the things I heard were real or just a product of my imagination. But what happened that night, the thing that changed everything, was something I could never forget. I was doing my usual round, walking through the dark, long corridors, when I heard something. A faint sound, like a distant echo. I stopped, looked around, but there was no one. At first, I didn't give it much thought, figuring it was the echo of my own footsteps bouncing off the factory walls. But then, something changed. As I moved down one of the hallways furthest from the entrance, I heard the sound again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just an echo. It was my name. Someone, or something, had whispered my name from the darkness of the factory. I stopped dead in my tracks, feeling a chill run down my spine. There couldn't be anyone else there. It was impossible. The factory had been closed to the public for years, and I was the only worker on the night shift. I told myself it must be some kind of acoustic phenomenon, a distortion caused by the factory's structure. But as I tried to calm down, the sound returned, this time clearer. It was my name, spoken with a disturbing softness, as if someone was standing right behind me. I turned around immediately, but there was nothing, just darkness, the sound of the wind seeping through the broken windows and the distant hum of the fluorescent lights. I tried to ignore it and continue with my round, but I couldn't shake what I had heard. My mind played tricks on me, making me wonder if it had really been an echo or if someone else was there. I decided the best thing to do was to investigate, and so I did. I walked to the area where I thought I had heard the whisper, but found nothing. The shadows seemed longer and denser than usual, and the feeling that something was watching me didn't go away. That night, I tried not to think about it anymore, but I knew something had changed. Whatever was in that factory, it wasn't just an empty structure. Something else was present, something I couldn't explain. After that night, things were never the same. Every time I returned to the factory, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. The echoes I had previously ignored started to seem more intentional, as if they had a purpose. And the worst part was that they seemed directed at me. One night, a few days after hearing that strange whisper, I decided to face my fears and explore the factory more thoroughly. If there was something there, I wanted to find out. Armed with my flashlight and my sense of logic, or at least what was left of it, I ventured into the deeper hallways of the building, the ones I had always avoided because of their desolation. As I moved forward, the sounds seemed to intensify. They weren't just echoes of footsteps. I began to hear fragments of conversations, whispers that seemed to come from different directions. The most unsettling part was that from time to time, those voices repeated things I had said, as if they were mocking me. I reached a door that had always been closed, an old office or machine room. Something inside me told me not to open it, but curiosity and the fear of the unknown pushed me to turn the handle. The door creaked open, echoing down the hallway. When I turned on the flashlight, I found an empty room with no windows and years of accumulated dust covering the floor. However, something was wrong. The echo of my own footsteps didn't sound normal. It was as if someone was walking alongside me, mimicking my every move. I stood still, and the footsteps stopped. But when I took a step back, the footsteps continued, moving toward me. Fear took over at that moment. I knew something wasn't right, that I wasn't alone in that factory. It was as if the very walls were conspiring against me, amplifying every sound, making me doubt what I was hearing. I left the room immediately, closing the door behind me, but the footsteps didn't stop. Now they echoed louder, as if someone invisible was following me down the hallways. I tried to stay calm, telling myself that no one was there, that it had to be a combination of strange acoustics and my mind playing tricks on me. But the voice in the back of my head knew the truth. Something in that factory was not natural. Just as I was about to leave the area, I heard a scream that made my blood run cold. It was my own voice and screaming from the end of one of the hallways. The echo of my scream bounced off the walls, but the most terrifying part was that I hadn't screamed. My legs began to tremble and I struggled to breathe. Every fiber of my being told me to run, to get out of there immediately, but an inexplicable force kept me frozen in place. Finally, I gathered enough courage to turn around and head for the exit, but as I moved, the footsteps intensified, and now I heard them clearly right behind me. I could almost feel the presence following me, as if it was about to touch my shoulder at any moment. I knew that if I didn't leave soon, something terrible would happen. I ran through the hallways, my breath ragged and my heart pounding in my ears. As I reached the exit, I turned around one last time, expecting to see my pursuer, but there was nothing, only darkness and the echo of my own footsteps fading into the distance. I ran like I had never run before. The cold that enveloped me wasn't just from the abandoned factory, but from the icy terror that had settled deep within me. As my feet pounded the concrete floor, I could hear the echoes of my own footsteps reverberating off the walls, but I knew I wasn't alone. Something was behind me, something I couldn't see, but could feel. Every time I tried to look back, the footsteps would stop, and every time I moved forward, I would hear them again, now closer, more threatening. Sweat ran down my forehead as I tried to orient myself in the darkness, desperately searching for the exit from that cursed factory. The flickering lights in the hallways only intensified my sense of disorientation, as if the factory itself was toying with me, preventing my escape. The path to the exit seemed endless. The shadows around me seemed to stretch and distort in a way that defied logic. I felt that with every step I took, the factory was changing, as if the hallways were rearranging themselves to keep me trapped inside. The echo of the footsteps grew louder, resonating not just behind me, but also on both sides, as if something was closing in on me. Finally, in the distance, I saw the faint light of the exit. It was weak, but at that moment, it felt like a beacon of salvation. I knew I had to reach it before the echoes, or whatever was producing them, caught up with me. I pushed my body to its limits, running toward the light as if my life depended on it. Just a few meters from the door, something changed. The air around me became dense, heavy, and I felt a pressure in my chest that made it hard to breathe normally. It was as if the factory itself was trying to stop me from escaping, but I didn't stop. Gathering all my strength, I lunged toward the exit, breaking the suffocating silence of the factory. When I crossed the threshold and stepped outside, the cold night air hit me hard. I stopped dead, gasping and sweating as I tried to process what had just happened. The echoes had stopped completely, and behind me, the factory seemed as quiet and still as ever. Yet, I knew something had changed forever. It wasn't just the factory that was cursed, but me too. After that night, I quit working at the factory. I couldn't go back into that place knowing what I had experienced. At first, I thought the terror I felt would fade with time, that the feeling of being watched or followed would disappear once I left the factory behind. But I was wrong. The echoes, those footsteps that seemed to follow me, never fully disappeared. Sometimes, in the silence of the night, while I was trying to sleep, I would hear them again. At first, I thought they were street noises or neighbors, but soon I realized they were the same echoes I had heard in the factory, the same cadence, the same rhythm, as if something had left that place with me. I often found myself checking the corners of my house, convinced that something was watching me. Every shadow, every out-of-place sound reminded me of that night at the factory. Even in my dreams, the endless hallways of the factory continued to appear, always with that distant echo chasing me. The feeling that something or someone was still waiting for me never fully went away. Months have passed since that night, but the fear persists. I've tried to rationalize what happened, to convince myself that it was all a product of my mind, of the oppressive solitude and silence of the factory. But every time I close my eyes, I see those shadows stretching out. I hear those footsteps echoing behind me, and I know deep down that the factory isn't done with me yet. I don't know if I'll ever find peace again. The echoes, those damned echoes, still follow me. They're always there in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to catch up to me again. Maybe they never will. Maybe it's all just my mind playing tricks on me. But one thing is certain. I will never forget what I experienced in that factory. I will never stop fearing that one day those echoes will come looking for me again. A few years ago, while I was still searching for direction in my life, I accepted a job as a night security guard in a large warehouse. It wasn't the most exciting job, but it provided the peace I needed. The nights were quiet, almost completely silent, except for the faint hum of a few deactivated machines and the echo of my footsteps resonating through the long, empty hallways. My routine consisted of patrolling those corridors, checking that everything was in order, and watching the security cameras. It was a simple job and, on most nights, rather monotonous. Nothing seemed out of place. Little by little, I lulled myself into a false sense of security, believing that nothing strange could ever happen in such a lonely place. But one night, something different occurred. I was sitting in the security room, watching the monitors as usual, when I noticed something out of the ordinary on one of the cameras. There, among the boxes in one of the corridors, a dark figure was moving. No one else was supposed to be in the warehouse. At first, I thought it was a reflection or maybe a glitch in the camera system, but the figure remained there, moving slowly in the shadows. I decided I couldn't ignore it. I grabbed my flashlight and left the security room, trying to convince myself that there was a logical explanation for everything. As I walked through the dark hallways, the oppressive silence enveloped me. The warehouses, which had once felt so familiar, now felt different. The air was heavier, and each step I took echoed with an unsettling force. I reached the hallway where I had seen the figure. At first glance, everything seemed in order. The boxes were stacked, the space was empty as usual, and there was no trace of any movement. I passed my flashlight from side to side, hoping to catch something strange, but there was nothing. Yet a chilling sensation ran down my spine. I decided to move further, exploring the darker corners of the warehouse. Though I tried to stay calm, every little sound, the creak of a box, the faint echo of a distant thud, made my heart beat faster. I was sure I had seen something. As I neared the end of the hallway, I heard a subtle sound, like the rustle of fabric or a slight movement, barely perceptible. I stopped in my tracks, but I couldn't see anything. Fear started to take hold, and though my logic told me there was nothing there, my instinct told me that something or someone was watching me from the shadows. After thoroughly checking the hallway and finding nothing, I decided to return to the security room. As I walked back, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me, or perhaps there was something in that warehouse that I didn't understand. When I sat down again in front of the monitors, something even more unsettling awaited me. My eyes landed on one of the cameras, and what I saw left me paralyzed. On the monitor, a dark figure stood still, motionless in the middle of the hallway. But this time, it wasn't just a simple shadow. It was my own silhouette. I recognized my posture, the shape of my body. It was me, standing in front of one of the cameras, staring directly at the lens. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. My mind resisted accepting what I was seeing. How was it possible? I was sitting in the security room, watching the screen, but there I was, an exact image of myself, motionless in the hallway. My heart pounded, and fear gripped me in a way I had never experienced before. I tried to move, to do something to break that terrifying moment, but my eyes remained glued to the screen, unable to look away from that impossible image. Was it a reflection? An optical illusion? It couldn't be real. But the longer I stared, the more I felt that something was staring back at me, as if that silhouette, my own image, was aware of me. Panic took over me in an uncontrollable way. I couldn't stay there a second longer. I jumped up and ran toward the warehouse exit, not looking back. My footsteps echoed through the empty hallways, each strike of my shoes on the concrete floor seeming to multiply, as if someone or something was running behind me. As I moved forward, the fear grew with every step. There were no signs of life around me, but the feeling that something was following me was overwhelming. The shadows seemed to stretch in the corners, and every creak, every noise amplified in my mind, making me imagine the worst. The warehouse, which had once seemed a dull but safe place, had now transformed into a labyrinth from which I felt I might never escape. Finally, I saw the exit door ahead of me. A sense of relief flooded over me, but it didn't last long. As I neared the door, I turned my head one last time to see if there was something behind me, some clue of what had been chasing me. And there it was, the empty corridor, as if nothing had happened, as if the terror I had just experienced was nothing more than a bad dream. I crossed the door and found myself outside the warehouse, feeling the cold night air hit me. I was out, safe, or at least that's what I wanted to believe. However, the doubt persisted, and the fear that gripped me didn't fade with the exit. I knew that, even though I had left the warehouse behind, what I had seen, or whatever had seen me, would never leave me in peace. As the days went by, I tried to forget. I quit the job immediately and never returned to the warehouse. At first, I thought that with distance and time, the feeling of fear would fade, like a bad memory that would eventually disappear into oblivion. But it didn't. That night in the warehouse had left a mark on me that I couldn't erase. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of my silhouette on the monitor reappeared. I tried to convince myself it was just a camera glitch, a technical malfunction, but deep down I knew it wasn't. What I saw that night was something more, something I couldn't explain, but that I felt deeply. It was as if a part of me had been trapped in those dark corridors, something that had watched me from the other side. Even outside the warehouse, that feeling of being watched never completely went away. At night, when the house was quiet, I sometimes heard noises, faint creaks, as if something was moving in the shadows. I told myself it was all in my head, that these were just memories playing tricks on my mind, but the fear remained, latent. For a long time, I avoided any job that reminded me of the warehouse, any place that enveloped me in absolute silence. The trauma stayed with me, that constant feeling that something was still watching me, that I hadn't fully escaped. I had left the warehouse, yes, but the doubt persisted. Had I really left whole, or was a part of me still trapped there, silently watching on those monitors that never stopped showing the impossible? I never got clear answers about what happened that night. I don't know if it was a hallucination, a trick of the mind, or something darker that I can't comprehend. What I do know is that I will never return to a place like that, and that the fear of what I saw, or what saw me, will be with me forever. A few years ago, I worked at a gas station on the side of a nearly deserted highway. It wasn't the most exciting job, but it allowed me to spend the nights in relative peace. The night shifts were lonely, customers rarely came, and when they did, they were usually truck drivers or travelers needing to refuel before continuing their journey. Often, hours would pass without anyone appearing. The silence was deep, only interrupted by the hum of the station's lights and the occasional sound of a distant engine. It was a monotonous routine, but I had gotten used to it. However, one night, just before dawn, I saw something I will never forget. In the distance, amidst the darkness of the highway, I saw a figure walking towards the station. At first, I didn't give it much thought. I assumed it was just another traveler. But as the figure approached, I started to notice something strange. The man walked slowly, covered in dust, and something about his posture made me uneasy. His clothes looked old, worn out, as if he had been wandering for days. As he approached the light of the gas station, I noticed that his eyes were empty, lifeless, as if there was no one behind them. I decided to greet him from inside the shop, asking if he needed anything, but the man didn't respond. He just kept walking without diverting his gaze, and that's when I noticed the most disturbing thing. His feet weren't touching the ground. He was floating, as if gravity had no effect on him. A chill ran down my spine. Fear began to take hold of me. But I couldn't look away from that figure slowly advancing toward me. I tried speaking again, but the man still didn't react. His presence grew more oppressive, and I couldn't comprehend what was happening. Then, suddenly, he raised his hand and pointed into the darkness behind him. My heart raced as the man, without saying a word, lifted his arm and pointed toward the dark highway he had left behind. Instinctively, I looked in that direction, even though a part of me already knew I shouldn't. At first, I saw nothing. The darkness seemed impenetrable, dense, as if it were alive. However, after a few seconds, something began to move. What I saw froze me in place. Something not human moved within the blackness. It was a shadow, larger than any man, silently creeping towards us. It had no defined shape, but it emanated a malevolent presence, something primitive, as if it came from the deepest part of the night. I stood there, paralyzed, unable to move or react. The man kept pointing in that direction, with the same empty expression on his face. But it wasn't him that terrified me. It was that thing, that impossible shadow slowly making its way towards me, as if it knew exactly who I was and what it wanted. My survival instinct finally took over. Without a second thought, I spun on my heels and ran inside the shop. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt adrenaline pumping through my veins. I slammed the door shut behind me and stood there, back against the wall, trying to catch my breath while my mind struggled to comprehend what I had just witnessed. I couldn't stay there any longer. As soon as the sun rose, I gathered my things and left the job without any explanation. I knew I would never set foot in that gas station again. I couldn't explain what I had seen that night, but since then, the image of the floating man and that thing following him has been etched in my mind, like a recurring nightmare I can't wake up from. Though the days pass, the feeling of being watched never fully went away. Even today, years later, I still wonder what would have happened if I had stayed a second longer, if that shadow had caught up to me. It's a thought that haunts me, and sometimes I wonder if I truly escaped or if somehow I'm still trapped in that darkness creeping behind me. A few years ago, I got a night job as a gravedigger in an old cemetery on the outskirts of town. It was a lonely and cold place, but it paid enough to cover my expenses, so I didn't complain. My tasks were simple: keep the place tidy, make sure everything was in order, and do small repairs if needed. Most nights were quiet, and though the atmosphere was gloomy, I had gotten used to the calm of the place. One of those nights, as I was doing my usual rounds among the tombstones, something caught my attention. In the distance, I saw a figure slowly walking between the graves. At first, I didn't think much of it. I assumed it was a homeless person who had sneaked in to sleep among the mausoleums. It wasn't uncommon to find people like that in such places. However, there was something strange about the way this person moved. I decided to approach and tell them they couldn't be there. As I walked towards the figure, I noticed that its movements were too smooth, as if it wasn't really walking on the ground. Fear began to creep in, but I still didn't have a reason to be terrified. When I got a few meters away, the figure simply disappeared. There was no sound, no sign that they had run or hidden. They just vanished, as if they had never been there. A chill ran down my spine, and at that moment, I heard something that made my hair stand on end. A dull thud coming from beneath the ground, as if something or someone was banging from inside a grave. The sound of the knocking from underground filled me with terror, but something inside me urged me to keep investigating. With trembling hands and my heart pounding in my chest, I moved closer to where the sounds were coming from. The ground was disturbed, as if someone had hastily dug it up. That's when I saw something I'll never forget: an open grave. It couldn't be. That grave was supposed to be sealed. As I got closer, I saw that the coffin inside the grave was empty. The fear I felt turned into pure panic. My legs shook, and a sense that something much worse was about to happen overwhelmed me. I didn't know if I should stay or run, but one thing was clear. Whatever had been buried there was no longer there. The reality of what I had just witnessed hit me hard. Without thinking twice, I turned and ran. I felt as if something was watching me, as if that thing that had come out of the grave might be following me. My breathing was rapid, and cold sweat trickled down my face as I ran between the tombstones, desperately searching for the cemetery's exit. The next day, I quit. I couldn't set foot in that place again. But even though I left, the image of that open grave and the empty coffin never left me. To this day, I still wonder what or who came out of there and whether one day it will come looking for me. I've never worked in a place like that again, but sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I can still hear those knocks coming from underground. A few years ago, I worked as a receptionist at a hotel on the outskirts of the city, along a lonely road that barely saw any traffic at night. The night shift was monotonous. There were almost never any guests, and I spent the hours watching the clock or checking the hotel's security cameras. It was a quiet job, ideal for someone seeking peace after a long day. One night, everything changed. Just before midnight, the automatic doors opened, and a man walked into the lobby. He wore a hood that covered part of his face, and his appearance seemed strange. He slowly approached the front desk and asked for a room. Something in his voice, in the way he moved, made me nervous. I tried not to show it and handed him the keys to room 203. I watched as he headed towards the elevator, but that unsettling feeling wouldn't leave me. I sat in front of the security cameras, watching the empty hallways, when suddenly I saw him. The hooded man was standing still, in the middle of the corridor, staring directly at the camera. A chill ran down my spine. I tried not to pay much attention, but every time I switched cameras, there he was, standing in different parts of the hotel, watching. His behavior was unnerving. What was he doing? Why wasn't he going into his room? The uncertainty and fear began to overwhelm me. I decided to pick up the phone and call his room, but there was no answer. That's when things became even more terrifying. I checked the rear entrance camera and saw him. He was standing outside, hands in his pockets, staring directly at the back door, as if waiting for me to come out. How had he gotten there so quickly? How did he know exactly where I was? I froze, unsure of what to do. The hotel was empty, and there was no one else to help me. The feeling of being hunted grew stronger with every passing second. Panic began to take over. My mind raced for a quick solution, but fear was paralyzing my movements. I decided to lock both the front and back doors to keep him out, but I couldn't just sit there waiting. I knew that somehow he was coming for me. With every second that passed, I felt his presence getting closer, as if he wasn't just a man, but something more, something playing with my mind. The cameras kept showing his figure, now moving around the exterior of the hotel. Anxiety was suffocating me. I ran to the kitchen, hoping to find an alternate way out. The kitchen was dark, filled with shadows that seemed to move around me, feeding my paranoia. The silence was so deep that any sound, no matter how small, made me jump. Just when I thought I had lost him, I saw him again. This time he was closer, watching me through a dirty window on the other side of the kitchen. I couldn't believe it. How was he moving so fast? Every corner I thought was safe became his new vantage point. Desperate, I found the kitchen's emergency exit. My hands trembled as I tried to open the heavy door. I knew that if I didn't leave at that moment, it might be too late. Finally, the door gave way, and I ran into the darkness of the deserted road. I felt like he was right behind me. I didn't dare look back, but his footsteps seemed to echo in my mind, like a sound I couldn't escape. My breathing quickened, and it became harder to keep running. Finally, I saw a truck approaching on the road. I raised my arms, frantically waving my hands, praying that the driver would see me. The vehicle screeched to a stop, and I climbed into the cab without even looking at the driver. As we drove away from the hotel, I turned my head for a moment and saw his figure standing in the middle of the road, watching as I left. I never returned to that place, but the feeling of being watched never completely went away. If you liked it, comment below, like and subscribe.